Welcome to In the Clouds, a DIAC podcast. I'm Sam.
I'm Hunter.
And I'm Cush.
Yeah, today we've got Cush on. Cush has been working on like deep tech incubation in Latin America.
Yep.
And could you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on?
Yeah, so we run an innovation lab called Odisea, and the whole premise is how do we accelerate the development of frontier technologies in Latin America, right? So, and when we think about that, it's basically this like full stack set of different offerings that we bring to the table. We start off by generating sort of insights and knowledge, right? You know, what's really exciting about this world is that it's just complete novelty, right? Both from a technological standpoint, but from a geographic standpoint as well. So in order to kind of go into the jungle and know where you're going, you always need a map, right? So that's what we do. We start off by sort of generating insights, trying to get a sense for what's going on, who are the key players, where are the problem sets. And then from that, we've developed a series of different programs that allow us to foster and develop frontier technologies in the region, right? So we focus a lot on crypto right now, look at some AI, but we're looking to expand outwardly towards biotech and clean tech and energy and space tech and other verticals across sort of frontier technologies. So the programs that we run within these different verticals are, we start off by doing technical education. Like I'm a big believer, education, like part of this, sort of content creation is part of that, right? Getting the word out there, but very focused on technical education is like the pillar of development for the work we're doing. Then we run hackathons. Last year we did the biggest hackathon in crypto in Latin America, which was really awesome. Yeah. Then we do incubation programs. So again, you can start to see like the whole journey for people. You go through an incubation program, then you join our accelerator where you actually get funding, you get access to world-class mentors from the crypto industry. And then we have different tracks for people, right? So if you want to, keep building your own thing, you go through these different sort of programs we run, or you can also join our team through our venture studio and our developer shop where we build out products kind of in-house or get hired by different folks to build products for them. And then we've got sort of what we call, this year we're going to be setting up two different funds. One is a venture fund to invest in sort of private deals in the region, and then one's a hedge fund that looks to activate capital from Latin America and bring it to public markets. We do some consulting on the side as well for different teams that want to understand how they can engage in the region. And then underpinning all of this is culture, right? Because it's not just about like tech and development of software, but actually how people relate to it and what their experience is with these frontier concepts as well. So that's kind of our whole ecosystem. Oftentimes people are like, how the hell do you do all of this? But really it's like, it's very synergetic, right? And like one thing leads to the other. Like fundamentally, I guess our thesis is, we can dive into this a little bit more, but basically Latin America is a region that comes from a really sort of long history of centralization of power. And what ends up happening is you end up sort of disenfranchising quite a lot of communities. And so, our thesis is as we are able to propagate information and access to tech, we're basically able to disintermediate a lot of the traditional industries, whether that's finance or governance or science, healthcare, education, what have you, and really start to sort of shift the narrative in the way that technologies sort of brought forward in the region. So that's a bit of an overview on us and the thesis behind the project. Yeah.
Cool. I love that because it really makes it clear like LATAM act like accelerating Latin America and like kind of the focus there. We really think a lot about DIAC and like the kind of principles behind that, like democratization, decentralization, and defensive like acceleration, right? And so even like in general, kind of how Latin America is, or at least tech companies in Latin America, and kind of this disintermediation that's happening there is like super aligned. So kind of one thing I'm just curious about your perspective on, like, what do you think the crossover between LATAM AC and DIAC is like? What pops out to you there?
Yeah, so I think there's a ton of overlap, to be honest. I mean, even just conceptually, this notion of like AC as a whole thesis, right?
Acceleration,
it's like, hey, let's foster technology, let's promote it, let's nurture it, and do it in such a way that's beneficial to society. I think that's like the key premise that DIAC sort of brings to the table is, let's be cognizant of like the current power structures that exist and make sure, as you say, to sort of promote decentralization and defensive acceleration as well. Because it's not like we're starting accelerationism on a blank slate, but rather there are a lot of these sort of incumbent power structures that we need to be cognizant of. And I think it's particularly expressed in, again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the centralization and corrupt nature of like governance, say, for example, in Latin America. So I think that's where I'm really excited to see a lot of the work that the DIAC movement brings, and we're very inspired by what you're doing with the DIAC kind of space and the thought leadership there, because it allows us to basically say, hey, how do we then shift a lot of this same energy and thesis and propagate it throughout Latin America?
Yeah, I think one thing that's been really fascinating to me is just seeing kind of the communities that these LATAM AC, EAC, EUAC, DIAC, what communities are kind of propagating these ideas. And to me, when I think about earlier this year, Aleph, Ciudad de Crecimiento, as well as Edge Lana, things like Network School, it's interesting to see that there's kind of these societies that are, or sort of these new kind of test maps for society where we're seeing people kind of test out new things and see what works in a really agile way. And it feels like maybe like in these little microcosms, there's opportunities to see what might work on a larger scale within society. It's like if we can prove these things out in like a smaller test net, then maybe they'll be adopted by kind of some of the bigger existing structures that can't move as quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, that's what I love about, we were talking earlier, just like why crypto is such a great place. I sort of think about it to some extent as like a petri dish for all of us, like play with our ideas and explore, and because there's so much openness and creativity that's always welcome in crypto. Because you guys are very focused on AI and some cryptography in there as well. But the crypto kind of ecosystem and community gives you the tools and the resources and the network to push your ideas out into the world, right? And that's like why we've been super focused on crypto, is because there are so many different avenues through which you can explore these principles. And then scale it outwardly to the rest of the world, right? And I think it's like fringe ideas, right? Start in these very kind of close, tight-knit communities, and then are able to grow and sort of expand from there.
Totally. Also, I think the adoption of crypto in Latin America has also been very interesting, especially in like Argentina, even in like Venezuela. I think, I don't know, I'm curious on your thoughts there, because it's something, at least like living in the US, like crypto is adopted by people who are interested in technology, sometimes people speculating. There's no like real, sometimes there feels like there's not real problems that crypto solves here.
Yeah, the real world use cases are definitely like fewer and further between. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I used to, years ago, we accepted Bitcoin at a coffee shop I used to own.
Right.
Which was interesting, but it's not like to see
It wasn't required.
Right, yeah, to see it like really playing out in a different way in a place like Argentina where, there was kind of an experiment with a test net of getting a bunch of vendors onboarded to accept crypto, and you see things like Pinta token, and you see people using crypto in the real world. It's just a different paradigm that I've been accustomed to.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think you spoke about use cases, and this is the thing. Like, sometimes I feel that we're at ETH Denver right now, and I saw a tweet yesterday that was like, everyone feels tired and blah, blah, blah. And I can see how you'd feel tired. It's like the innovations, we've gone from 0 to 10, right? And like that incremental innovation, there's sort of diminishing returns there. When in reality, it's about, hey, how do we expand this technology? Because I think the technological like increments are, they're not going to be, sort of entire step functions, right? Like there's a few interesting things like ZK and so forth, but technologically speaking is like crypto's reaching this maturation point. We'll see things sort of happen, right? But it'll take longer. What I think this industry is really focused on now is how do we actually get this technology into the hands of people who really need it, right? And so what do people need it for? Things like how do, you access a loan, for example, that has a really low interest rate? How do you make sure that governance systems are like fair and transparent? We've seen lots of problems with that, say, in the likes of Venezuela, for example, right? How do you think about the way, you are rewarded for going through educational programs, right? It doesn't make sense in a region where education is already quite poor that people have to go through really long and arduous educational process before they get any rewards or incentives from the system, right? It's like why people end up selling, candy as a 5-year-old kid, right? So there, healthcare, like there are all these really exciting just use cases that I think the world is now sort of starting to think about, okay, well, great, we've built this incredible tech stack. Now let's get it into the hands of people who really, really need this, right? I mean, inflation's another awesome one, like Venezuela. Argentina's sort of in a better place. The country is really expensive now, but for a while, inflation was off the charts. So I think that's sort of the state of the industry. I'm curious, like for you guys, how you think about LATAM or what resonates with you of the movement?
I think obviously super bullish on Latin America as a general statement. After our time at Aleph, it really opened my eyes to this idea that that there are places where crypto is solving a problem. Because I was starting to feel on some levels almost a little bit jaded. The period of time, for example, that I was able to accept crypto as payment at my coffee shop was pretty range bound. It was early, and then I never really saw that solution pop up again. So I guess to me, it's just inspiring to see people who have found like a real need for this, and there's really like this different level of like almost product market fit. You see it with things like Reserve Protocol, which has been up and down through the years, but solved a real problem in Venezuela for a while. I think at one point was like the #1 downloaded finance app for Venezuela. So to me, I think what's really fascinating is I think all of these different acts like LATAM ACT, EU ACT, EAC, all these different versions are they're sort of representing like, I think in DIAC 1 year later, Vitalik kind of put out this call for cross-disciplinary collaboration, and I feel like that's what we're kind of seeing. It's like everyone's kind of they're looking at this movement and they're kind of tailoring it to fit their geopolitical circumstances and really it seems like each group is kind of taking it and running with it. For example, EUAC is just a lot more about like legislative stuff in Europe. It's like, how do we get out of this like legislative box? And so I guess one of the things that I'm kind of curious about with latam AC is, do you feel like it's expounding upon like the idea space of DIAC, like in terms of are the same core values kind of there in terms of defensive, decentralized, democratic, or is that more of a tangential element?
Yeah, no, I think it's like a really a core principle of latam AC, right? And I think there's, you mentioned EUAC, for example, and I think that's also always really important is when you think about these different like localized AC movements, right? Yeah, it makes sense that you want to sort of think about better regulation or deregulation perhaps in Europe. We are fortunate or unfortunate that there isn't much regulation when it comes to advanced technology in the region, just because they haven't really come from the region, right? I guess our take on what LATAM Act is fundamentally, we recognize that there's a ton of really talented potential in the region. We saw the likes of Open Zeppelin, Decentraland, MakerDAO be built in Latin America. Some hyper focused building happening in Argentina in particular, right? So it's all about how do we empower these emergent builders throughout the region so we can see more and more and more of these sort of incredible technologies propagate throughout the region. So that's one of the core principles for us, is just like empowerment of sort of disenfranchised or sort of budding builders, right? The other thing is build a bridge as well. So it does all compound to how do we democratize access to resources, to capital, to networks as well, right? Defensiveness is sort of taken into account when you think about the notion and the premise of, okay, given that there are these corrupt governance structures and financial systems that are really extractive and so forth, how do we respond to that, right? And how do we prepare ourselves in a world where we'll have to deal with these power structures kind of coming back to push up against us, right? I think what is really exciting too, particularly about Latin America and this accelerationist movement, is we're already seeing great progress happening. Like, first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender was El Salvador. Some of the first countries to start putting serious thoughts around like stablecoin legislation, Brazil. Argentina, there is a really high percentage of the people in the country there that use crypto. Venezuela as well. Mexico, there are $65 billion in remittances in Mexico every year from the US to Mexico. 10% of those happen on a single company's ledger, Bitso, right? So like, we're already seeing like billions of dollars be processed in crypto for remittances, like actually changing people's lives. So I think that's the other piece that we're also really excited about, is how do we just like continue sort of catalyzing this energy and make sure it propagates throughout the rest of the region.
Cool. One to kind of answer your question earlier of like, how do we think about DIAC and LATAM Act? One thing I think about DIAC is this principle of like democratization, right? It's kind of like, we don't want a small like cabal of people kind of making decisions. It should kind of be distributed. And I think about that with technology. Today, there's kind of like this almost like, I don't know, modern version of like digital like colonization, right? Where like a lot of the value is like in San Francisco, right? Like maybe using an Android device in Guatemala, right? Maybe your data is going and flowing back to the Bay Area, right? And so I think in terms of like democratization and decentralization, I think this is an opportunity with LATAM Act to kind of build technologies where the value is kept with the people who are generating the value.
Totally.
Right. And I think this is like a really nice kind of crossover, but I think it takes like kind of intention to like, okay, we're going to try to build something that's slightly different, that where like things are localized, right? And you see this when you travel globally.
Right.
Like not everyone uses Uber. Sometimes they have their own local apps, right? So doing that as well, I think. It's kind of something that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think it's super. I mean, it's super important. Like, we don't want to be net importers of technology. Like, we actually want to be exporters, right?
Yeah, sure.
Because and we need to make sure that like the value that's generated in the region as people onboard to different platforms, it actually stays there, right? Because oftentimes, I mean, we see it all the time in like the mining industry, for example, that comes into, the thing about Latin America is it has 42% of the world's biodiversity. It's incredibly rich in natural resources beyond, just biodiversity, and we have immense cultural diversity as well. The problem is usually the mechanics in the region are quite extractive, right? So you have like external players coming in, looking to extract as much value from a system, and rather like the way we present things and like our whole mission is how do we create a very localized economy where because we genuinely have everything we need to be completely self-sufficient, right? It's like some of our biggest exports are agriculture and food, and in a sort of world where we're seeing sort of food scarcity really come into the fore, and we have this sort of bountiful amount of natural resources, we need to make sure that we're protecting those natural resources and not allowing, these extractive dynamics to continue to occur across the region. So that's something we're like very cognizant of, right? And we with our work but it's a balance too. It's interesting, right? Because like you need external forces to catalyze local systems. And so I think that's like a balance we're always thinking about. I think ultimately like the solution is you build sufficient energy internally that then you can start your own flywheel, right? You're just like, putting energy or like more wood that comes from the outside, but then it just like is a fully blown fire and it, continues to sort of keep the engine going.
Yeah.
One way I like think about this a little bit is like from the standpoint of like digital sovereignty. I think this is one of like the important elements of digital sovereignty. It's like I think there is this kind of emergent paradigm that like if your data is leaving your country, like if you don't control it, it's like it's like the new oil.
Totally.
It's literally money leaving your country. And,
totally.
We see this like movement towards sovereignty. I think that's really interesting in terms of like these spaces becoming more like kind of their own little decentralized hubs with like things like the DePIN movement, the decentralized physical infrastructure networks. We met some guys earlier in the year at Aleph who were working on bringing sovereign internet to Zanzibar, I believe. And it's just interesting to see how these emergent technologies can empower places to create these ecosystems where instead of having the situation where extractive players are coming in and siphoning all the value out, they can kind of capture that and really get that flywheel running.
Totally. Yeah. And I think I think for, anyone listening to this podcast, and this is one of the things that we're always kind of communicating to the partners we work with as well. It's like, hey, you're coming in and like what you're doing is you're introducing like your know-how and your resources and so forth. But, our focus is cool. We want to generate this self-sustaining like ecosystem and community here. And then it ends up being like more beneficial for everyone because Latin America is no longer this like backwater or very kind of far behind society, but actually we can contribute a lot to the way the world operates and functions. I like some countries that I'm inspired by and think a lot about, Singapore, Estonia, Israel, which 50, 60 years ago, Shenzhen, you've got Dubai, these countries just a few decades ago were there wasn't really much going on there, right? But through this very concerted effort, they were able to massively grow. Not only that, be like key contributors when it comes to tech, when it comes to finance and so forth. So that's really the vision that we're seeing. We're already seeing pockets of it happening. Like El Salvador, I think they're in their early stages. But I mean, when you think about going from one of the world's most dangerous countries to now one of the world's most safest countries, I mean, that's just insane.
Truly.
So, you guys have to get Bukele on the podcast at some point.
He's on the list. We'll
next guest. Yeah.
But yeah, this has just been like kind of just great insight. One thing I'm curious about is like it's hard to really predict the future because we live in an age with accelerating technology. But what kind of vision of future do you have for Latin America? If you could kind of like just give one.
So I really love the solar punk philosophy.
Sure.
I know some people here are appreciative of like the lunar punk vision, but I think it probably aligns a lot with the DIAC movement.
Could you describe just for listeners like solar punk, lunar punk?
Yeah. So the premise of solar punk sort of ethos is what the world might look like when man and nature and technology all coexist in harmony, right? The lunar punk movement is a response to the solar punk movement, and it says that's all well and good. However, in sort of the ode to defensiveness and the fact that we do have these malicious players, we also need to think about sort of privacy and cryptography and how we can sort of counteract the kind of bad intents of other actors in a system. Aesthetically, I just love solar punk, to be honest. I think lunar punk is like more dark and so on. I'm just much more called towards the solar punk philosophy. So for all those who aren't familiar with like the aesthetics, and that's what I love, when you look up solar punk, is it first posits it as a like artistic and cultural movement more than anything. And I think that's one of the things that I really am inspired by, because you can see what the world might look like, right?
Yeah.
And
it's beautiful and inspiring. You're like, wow.
Yeah.
You're like, I want to live
here.
there. Literally, I want to live there, right?
We got to steer in the direction we want to go.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you know, all even like if you look at our like branding and communications at Odyssey, it's like all solar punk inspired. Like I'm constantly being like, hey guys, like more trees, more tropical, more beach, more green. You know, and because that's what I really want to see in this world, is like make sure that is the vision that we can bring forward into the world, and obviously adhering to these principles of lunar punk and DIAC as well, because inevitably it's like that's gonna happen. But I think that's the world I want to live in, and like that's the beautiful thing we were also discussing is like when you are an accelerationist and you think a lot about the role of technology in advancing human society and bettering our governance systems and financial and economic and social and so forth, you always have this like inherent sense of optimism.
Yeah.
So you're always like, oh my God, like I want to live in this world and I can actually do something to make it happen, because otherwise we just fall into this like nihilism and doomerism, which is just super detrimental for our mental states.
Yeah. And even for what we build, like if we think things are not going to go well, maybe you just build things differently or you think about things differently.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, in many ways I think DIAC is like, it's like there's some level of realism to it. It's like there are real risks. But it is this whole space of elucidating like what's possible. Like what is the future that we want to live in ultimately? You know, I mean, at the end of the day, like now is the time to think about it, right? I think now is the time to kind of draw a few lines in the sand and like set a course, set a trajectory that you know towards that world that you know brings out the best outcomes for everyone, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I think we probably wrap up, but I would like to say thank you to Sozu House for making this great podcast studio. This is in the clouds, but it's also a Sozu Pod episode. We've been staying here at ETH Denver. Sozu House has been a really great place to build, meet other fantastic, excellent builders. So just wanted to shout out to Sozu House.
And I just want to say thank you, Cush, for making time to be on the podcast.
I know,
I've been really impressed seeing everything that's been happening with Odyssey, kind of from all the way back at Aleph when I first kind of started to see the vision you're building, and it's come a long way, and it's very inspiring. And I think we need more people building in the space in the same way.
For sure. No, and thank you guys. You know, always great to, I think that's the magic of, you know, these convenings. It's and really beautiful to see us reconvene. You know, as you said, we met in Aleph, and now we see each other here, and just like constantly putting, because oftentimes when you're like sitting at home, like watching these podcasts, you're like, oh my God, this is so cool, right? But I think these like sort of encounters are super important. And no, thank you guys for, you know, being able to share this vision, and as well, like the whole Sozu pod team, the Sozu house team as well, like much appreciated, and let's do it.
Heck yeah.
All right, boys. Thank you.
Thanks guys. Till next time, thanks for watching In the Clouds. See you later.
Peace. Ciao.